If we prove our loyalty, then they will throw us some breadcrumbs. The very first step of making that reality come true is to deliver a resounding loss to the Democrats.
You are effectively supporting Trump. How would you respond to that?
Vast majority of Muslims are abandoning the two parties. They're not content with either of the major two parties. They're interested in third party voting. Genocide is a red line. I will not cross it. I will not step over those bodies when I go to the polling station in November. I have challenged Emgage board members and the CEO himself in WhatsApp groups since January and February. What would it take for you to walk away from the Democrats? This is exactly the type of politics, Jalal, who has put us into the genocide in the first place. That's why it upsets me, Jalal. That's why it upsets me.
The US elections are in full flow, with the two big political parties focusing on the key swing states that will decide this election. In states like Michigan, a slight movement of voters can determine the outcome. And this means Muslim voters may play a decisive role. This explains the frenetic activity, especially from the Democrats, in reaching out to disenchanted voters outraged at their continuous support for genocide. Just yesterday, a letter was leaked, probably planted by the Biden-Harris administration, suggesting pressure is being applied to the Israeli regime. It all seems for domestic context. The Democrats are desperate. That's why, incidentally, you've seen a greater focus and attack on those who are anti-Harris. And in particular, my interview with Sami Hamdi has come under a lot of focus, especially the sections that went viral. Now, to help us understand the political and intellectual climate, I've invited back onto the show Imam Tom Facchine. Imam Tom has been instrumental, I believe, in galvanizing Muslims behind the anti-Harris campaign, and he joins us from Pennsylvania. Imam Tom, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and thank you for joining us. And I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jalal, it's always great to do anything together. Hopefully next time, inshallah.
Inshallah ta'ala, it'd be great to see you sometime soon. Now, let's start with the video put out by Mehdi Hassan, where he effectively doubled down on endorsing Kamala Harris. He makes a few assertions in his interview or in his video, but can you specifically tackle, I think, the central claim that supporting a third-party candidate effectively gives Trump the presidency and Trump will be worse for Muslims?
Absolutely. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu rasulillah. Mehdi's video had several problematic claims. We'll focus on the one that you mentioned. Another one that he sort of put in was, or implied, was the equivalence of the genocide that's going on now in Palestine to other sort of things that have happened in Yemen, and the degree of responsibility. I think that he sort of made an allusion there that needs to be called out, that the degree of responsibility of the U.S. with Palestine is much higher than the degree of responsibility and active involvement of the U.S. in Yemen, though obviously what has been happening in Yemen is also quite tragic. Another of the egregious claims was that imams are sort of manipulating their masses by weaponizing the faith against them. He came up from a very secularist or pro-secularist idea of what we do when we do political analysis and talk as if our faith shouldn't inform our political decisions, as if we just have to completely lobotomize that part of our brain or our souls when we make political decisions. That was very strange. And the third one is more common, which you bring our attention to, and it deserves attention, the idea that Trump will be worse and that voting a third party is going to deliver a worse outcome. And this is not straightforward, nor is it apparently true for several reasons. First of all, political forecasting is very shady business, and Mubin Vaid has a very nice account of this on his Substack, which is named Occasional Reflections, where he goes through several scenarios and he demonstrates that while there might be more unpredictability with Trump, and we'll get to that in a second, it's not simple arithmetic to say that Trump is going to lead to a worse situation in Palestine, nor is it true that what is worse will extend for as long. So some of the examples and scenarios that Mubin had played out, it might be true that Trump is more ham-fisted, we say, and more egregious and more belligerent, but that might also accelerate the isolation and the eventual downfall of the genocidal occupying state of Israel, right? That is definitely something that has happened. In fact, You could argue that there is a precedence for this in recent history because since the Oslo Accords were signed, um, things that were the status quo in Palestine up until October 7th of 2023 was a slow genocide. It was just a slow genocide that was out of view. And because it was so slow, it was something that was easy to hide and forget and stop paying attention to. Now, after October 7th, 2023, the past year, things were accelerated and the genocide was accelerated to such an extent that it deserved and evoked universal condemnation from the world, both the masses of people and the political actors, which has actually put Israel in a much worse situation now we're in October 2024 than it was in September 2023. People are questioning Israel's right to exist. They're questioning the wisdom behind an Israeli-U.S. alliance. They're questioning AIPAC. They're questioning, unmitigated, unconditional military aid. They're questioning all sorts of things that a year and 1 month ago people were not questioning. So this doesn't unfold linearly, such that a worse or a more aggressive or a more accelerated situation necessarily leads to a worse situation. Things might, in certain scenarios, have to get bad quickly in order for them to fall apart and eventually break through to something better. But even then, and I know that we were planning on talking about this as well, there's other dimensions to which this sort of forecasting isn't necessarily the point. That this type of analysis, or the idea that Trump is going to be worse, assumes that all of the current political actors are going to continue to act in the way that they are. And the idea of voting for a third party and the idea for delivering a loss to the Democrats and finally attaching a political cost to Zionism or the support for the Zionist occupying state is precisely to change the behavior of political actors. That right now and up until now, political actors have only considered support for Zionism an asset. Therefore, their behavior has been very predictable. However, what if we were to put a cost to it that made it a liability? That anybody who was taking money from AIPAC or supporting, again, unconditional military aid or supporting the genocide in any sort of way, then became a one-term or a certain to lose or, politically precarious. If we were to construct that situation and achieve that reality, that would change the behavior of political actors, and you would see support for Zionism evaporate. Thomas Massey, the representative from the Appalachians, he has said something similar, that in private conversations, even Republicans are not happy having a babysitter from AIPAC follow them everywhere and see everything that they're doing. They're not happy to have to support Israel, but they do it in public because supporting Israel is a safe bet politically. It's a safe bet for their careers. It's a safe bet for their power. Once it stops being a safe bet, once it becomes a liability, people will avoid it like the plague. And it's up to us to make that reality come true. And the very first step, it's not going to happen immediately, but the very first step of making that reality come true is to deliver a resounding loss to the Democrats in this November election because of their support for genocide.
Imam Tom, your detractors will say that you may be punishing the Democrats, but inevitably, because you're calling upon Muslims to vote for a third party, and I'll come to who that third party may or may not be, but because you're calling upon Muslims to vote for a third party, you are effectively supporting Trump. How would you respond to that?
That's not true. Like, you support Trump by supporting Trump. You don't support Trump by supporting. This is the same type of fear mongering and scare tactics that keep us powerless. That there is a pathway to build political power for the U.S. Muslim community. And it has to do with using our vote strategically in a way that evades this sort of zero-sum two-party logic. That one of the most threatening things to our situation in the United States, and by extension, why do we care about United States politics? Because U.S. foreign policy sets the parameters for much of the world's foreign policy and what is happening. One of the reasons that we care is because as long as we only have two options and they continue to browbeat us into only operating within those two options are getting progressively worse. And I think that we've seen this. Even if you were to compare the differences in policy between Harris and Trump, to be frank, they're very few. They're very little. That most of the differences between the two candidates are in optics. That Harris is a super cop. She's somebody who made her reputation as as this sort of tough on crime person who was very, very toxic towards the African American community when she had her time in California. She's very bad, just like Trump, on immigration and the border. She's got all sorts of policies. If you track, we're saying 50 years of policy between Democrats and Republicans, they have only become more and more like each other. And they only become more and more like each other because there is no competition within the political space. There is no third party that is insurgent, that is trying to mount something that would change the behavior of these two political parties. And it was funny that Mehdi brought up the situation of Ross Perot, because Ross Perot in the early 90s is actually a perfect illustration of how a third party can change the political behavior of the main two parties. That Ross Perot ran on the idea of balancing the budget. Back then, that was something people cared about. You see how now that nobody even brings that up anymore, another sort of indictment of how the two-party system has unfolded and is working mostly in collusion with each other. Think Coca-Cola, Pepsi, rather than sort of opposing each other like they want you to think. That Ross Perot ran on the platform of balancing the budget. And that resonated with so many people that he took so many votes away, even though he didn't win, that he affected the policies of both parties when it came to the next election. The Democrats made sure that balancing the budget was part of their platform, and they did that to take away the power from the third party. So this is how political change happens, and don't let anybody tell you that it's not.
I just want to get some clarification from you about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a Zionist, right? And so is Kamala Harris. The Democrats and Republicans are currently strongly wedded to a pro-Israel, pro-Israeli defense policy. How do you measure them in terms of their vociferousness or the manner by which they may create a danger when it comes to just Palestine? Like, do you see one to be greater than the other, or the two to be equal to one another?
I think that Harris is very predictable, and she is ideologically tied to Zionism. From how I see Trump, I do not see Trump as ideologically tied to Zionism as Harris or the Democrats are. I see Trump as more opportunistically attached to Zionism, and therefore I see him as a wild card. I think that he is more unpredictable, both in his intent and his actions, and in the consequences of his actions. Now, whenever you get someone who's more unpredictable, obviously there is risk, and there is risk that something will be worse. But there is also risk that something will end up being better, either because he intends it or not. Okay, so let me give you a concrete example of how unintended consequences might end up being better. For example, when Trump was the president previously, he tried to beef up and bolster the CVE program, our equivalent of Prevent in the UK. And he renamed it it was called Countering Violent Extremism. It became Countering Violent Islamism. Okay, so he did it in this, again, very ham-fisted way that alienated a lot of people. People quit the program, and the program basically collapsed overnight because of his own incompetence. We remember the Trump days, how many of his cabinet positions, many of the staffing positions were completely empty, that it was a very dysfunctional government, and a lot of things didn't get done, right? This is by no design of his, but it's part of the unpredictability that comes with a Trump presidency. So there are opportunities within that unpredictability. When it comes to his intentions, even his intentions, I do not see Trump as being as ideologically committed to Zionism as Harris or the Democrats. I think that Trump, at the end of the day, is a businessman, and Trump will go where he thinks is going to be good for him. I think that, and if you carefully follow the things that he's said and done over the past 10 years, or the past 15 years, that this indicates that he has expressed frustration with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu has expressed frustration with him. Trump has said that Netanyahu is not a good faith actor when it comes to negotiations. Trump has said that that the U.S.'s ability to broker a deal, because he had sort of grandiose, machinations, we could say, or he had ambition to create this sort of master deal for the Middle East, and he thought that the Abraham Accords were part of that. He thought that Netanyahu, in addition to Netanyahu not being a good faith negotiator, he thought that the US's ability to negotiate this deal or to arbitrate this deal was compromised by it being perceived as being on one side, which it is. This is sort of the hypocrisy that the Biden administration will not name, that they are pretending to be negotiators and arbiters when in reality they are funders. They are funding one particular side of the genocide, and they are completely erasing the other. So Trump gets that. Now, what it would take to get Trump to actually act on that is a different matter. It would basically have to become costly. I think that if you make Zionism and the whole racket that is Israel, if you were to make it costly enough, I think that there is a scenario in which Trump would do something that would be detrimental to Israel, its survival and its existence, and the sort of perpetuation of its genocide. That's not saying it's a surefire thing, but I think that that possibility is there with the Trump administration as opposed to a Harris Democrat administration. And also, it should be said, don't take at face value the things that Netanyahu has said recently about Trump, and I believe that Mehdi brought this up in his video, that Netanyahu is hoping for a Trump presidency. You don't think that Netanyahu calculated very carefully what that statement was going to do, the action and the work that that statement was going to do when he said it? He wants the perception. I believe that Netanyahu wants people to perceive that he is hoping for a Trump presidency. But I do not think, if you go into the ether, I do not think that Netanyahu is actually deep down happy with Trump or has confidence in Trump. I think that they will butt heads, if for no other reason that they are both egomaniacs. They are both people who have their own agendas, and those agendas do not often align. So I think that, again, no one has a crystal ball in politics. There is a possibility that things could get really bad or even worse. However, I do think that there are certain fissures and opportunities that open up with a Trump regime that just simply aren't there when it comes to the Harris regime or the Democrats, who continue to feed us lies. They continue to treat us as if we're stupid. You mentioned the statement that was leaked about this sort of pressuring. Yeah, now we're going to set a deadline for Israel to sort of clean up its act, and it happens to extend past the election date. It's a 30-day deadline, while boots are going on the ground. U.S. boots are now on the ground supporting Israel militarily. This has been the policy of the Democrats since the beginning, that they will give you whatever lip service they think will break your resolve to oppose them on one hand, while they will keep on doing the same exact policy that they have been intending to do on the other hand. So there is, basically, to sum it up, I see there is zero possibility for change with a Democratic regime, and some, even if it's precarious, possibility for change under Trump, and a lot is best.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Imam Tom, a lot of this hinges on political foresight. And as you said, political analysis is not a scientific experience. And sometimes we can draw conclusions which are either superficial or slightly more deeper, but we can never be sure about politics in a year or in 2 years or 3 years' time. But let's come back to the principle that a lot of these arguments, a lot of the debates that are currently raging in Muslim communities in America, a principle that underpins this conversation, and that's the principle of the lesser of the two evils. Now, I understand, although we use it in general parlance, this is an Islamic principle. There's a principle within Islamic history or classical Islamic or normative Islamic understanding of the lesser of the two principles idea. Can you give us some idea of how scholars view this principle and how maybe we can apply it to the elections?
It's a very, very good question. And honestly, there needs to be a deep study into every Islamic principle that has been misused and abused in the last 12 months. We've seen the Edit police come out and try to prevent people from holding Muslim leaders accountable, saying, oh, but he's a good brother. Oh, but you have to give them 70 excuses. Oh, but you don't know what's in his heart. Even as a particular individual completely sells out the Muslims in Palestine and at home. And you see the application, the wanton and sort of maximalist application of this lesser of two evils principle, which is a principle in fiqh, but it has conditions to it and it has situations. And it is a juz'i principle. That is, it is a principle that is maybe used in the instance, a short-term instance where there's an individual calculus being made. It is not a long short-term strategy. Okay. And that, I think, is the key difference when we're trying to map this fiqhi principle or this qawaid or this qaida onto politics, is that if you continue, and this has been the political establishment's tactic or strategy for some time, if you take lesser of two evils as your consistent basis upon which you're making decisions for years and years and years, your options are going to get more and more evil, right? It doesn't have anything. There's no entrance within this sort of the application of this rule to do anything to make your situation better or to make your choices better. So if you're forced into a situation where you have to choose between two things, then yes, you always are required to choose the lesser of two harms if there are harms present in both things. However, it is not a strategy for long-term decision making. Rather, there are other principles such as sadd, such as blocking the means, where you are attempting to look into the future and see, well, if we make this decision now, then it's actually going to create a worse situation 4 years from now, or 8 years from now, or 12 years from now. And so we might actually have to suffer a lesser harm. And now we'll flip the logic on its head. We might have to suffer what in the short term is a greater harm in order to prevent a long-term harm. Okay. So if we're going to say, okay, lesser of two evils, sure, perhaps, but which one is lesser, first of all? Second of all, perhaps that you have to take on a greater evil up front and initially in order to prevent a more long-term egregious evil down the road. And third of all, this is no way to plan a community or to plan community power. That if you look at how the dawah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was conducted from the time of Mecca to then the first hijrah to Habasha to the subsequent hijrah to Medina, it was not every single situation lesser of two evils, lesser of two evils, lesser of two evils, lesser of two evils. There was a concrete plan to build power. There was a concrete plan to identify opportunities. There was a concrete plan to build leverage. This is why the Prophet ﷺ sent some of the Muslims to Abyssinia. This is why he went to Ta'if to try to see if the people of Ta'if were responsive. This is why he had Dar al-Arqam and had this sort of liaison with the people of Medina as they came to Mecca and other tribes when they came to Mecca. That was not the only principle being used. And if lesser of two evils becomes the only principle that we're using, we will find ourselves in a very, very evil situation.
Now, Imam Tom, there are some organizations in America that have come out in support of Harris. I mean, one such organization is Emgage. And of course, we don't have any members with us today to defend their position. So I think we need to be aware of that. But can you make sense of their stance? Like, why would they argue that we should support Harris?
So Emgage is an AstroTurf organization. That's the opposite of grassroots. That means it doesn't have any organic place within the Muslim community in and of itself. It was founded in the early 2000s by Ismailis in Florida. It was not even pretending to be at its onset a group that was supposed to represent Muslims. I forget what their initial incorporating name was. It was something completely different. It had nothing to do with Muslims. One year they wake up and decide that they want to represent Muslims. And they have sort of done this stance for a while now, where they present themselves to the Democratic Party as the power brokers of the Muslim community, when the reality is they are no such thing. And they have done things such as taking credit for coalition work that they've done, Get Out the Vote. You know, they had their Million Muslim Vote sort of campaign in previous elections. That was a coalition effort with CARE and with other sort of organizations that do have organic roots within the Muslim community. And what Emgage does is it positions itself and sells itself to the Democratic establishment as sort of these representatives of the Muslim community, and it's not. So in response, or in sort of what's in it for Emgage, Emgage gets specific access to power. They get certain appointments. If you track sort of the political careers of their founders, they have relationships and people in the Department of Defense, the small contracts and small business contracts, a person within the Department of Defense whose job is to make sure that minorities get a larger piece of the military industrial complex pie. That is someone who's a former Emgage board member. right? You've got people who have worked in all sorts of capacities that are complicit with U.S. empire. So there's an exchange that goes on when it comes to positions. There's also access that takes place. And there's also, we should talk about this, there's sort of other machinations that are going on. And it's relevant to another question I know you intended to ask about using U.S. empire for let's say, narrow or nationalistic or ethnic aims. There are several people at the high level at Emgage that are Syrians that are attempting to use, they believe that the Democrats are the ones that are going to deliver the policy that they want on Syria. And so that they are all in on the Democrats. They've essentially sold out Palestine for Syria. And I have evidence. I have, on my phone, I've got a particular document that was signed by Wael al-Zayat, the current CEO of Emgage, where he signs his name off on the importance on arming Israel as a counterweight to Iran, because if Iran has too much power in the Middle East, then it will be bad for Syria and will turn Syria into another Iraq, which, of course, we don't want that to happen to Syria. However, we're not willing to arm Israel in order to achieve that goal. And that is problematic to the Palestinians and to the Ummah. So this is the type of organization that is endorsing Harris. And you'll find that where does their money come from? Does their money actually come from the Muslim community? No, it doesn't. It comes through grants. It comes through the tentacles of the Democratic Party, who launder their money through this sort of nonprofit conglomerate. There's a sort of nonprofit industrial complex, if you will, of different organizations that are funded indirectly by Democratic Party and Democratic Party aligned groups. And those are the types of organizations that are either coming out explicitly for Harris or are, even worse, exploiting the fissures in the Muslim American community in order to basically drum up support for Harris. So we have this particular letter. After we did a very grassroots, organic imams letter, we had over 130 imams sign it. Omar Suleiman signed it, Yasser Qadi signed it, Dawood Walid signed it, myself signed it, instructing the Muslims of America to not vote for either Harris or Trump, to instructing them to vote third party, to vote your conscience, that this was something that caused the establishment to panic. This was true grassroots power. And so they came up with their own letter, conducted by a Sanusi. A Sanusi works for ISNA. He was praised by the ADL. He's the ADL's man, Anti-Defamation League, a very Zionist organization. They got together, I think 25 imams and religious leaders, from the African-American community, mostly the Warithuddin Muhammad community. And so this is something where there's a disconnect and there's a fissure between the sort of immigrant Muslim community and the Warithuddin Muhammad community and the African-American community at large. However, this was exploited. This is being exploited by groups like Emgage, who set up the Black Muslim Leadership Council, another similar initiative, and by Sanusi and his crew from ISNA, who are doing something similar. So that's fairly cynical. They're basically attempting to use these fissures to portray or manifest, if you'll use common parlance or contemporary parlance, speak into being this Muslim support for Harris, to portray this perception that Muslims are falling in line for Harris, that Trump is the greater threat, that we really only care about domestic issues, that Palestine is just one issue. This is something that we're hearing. Sana Saeed, formerly of AJ Plus, leaked in the past week a whole list, an internal document that such groups are using as talking points against the Muslims in order to beat them back into supporting Harris in a month. So this is a very inorganic effort. Whereas if you look at the pulse of the community, and Yaqeen Institute has released data on this, the pulse of the community is actually very, very different from this perception that groups like Emgage are trying to sell to the Democrats to make them feel good about their prospects in November. That the reality is that the vast majority of Muslims are abandoning the two parties. They're not content with either of the major two parties. They're interested in third-party voting. They're looking to vote their conscience. They cannot vote for somebody who is responsible for the genocide. They have stood up on 2 feet and said that genocide is a red line. I will not cross it. I will not step over those bodies when I go to the polling station in November, that I have standards and you cannot cow me into abandoning these principles just for, for other sort of ulterior motives.
Okay. And as I said, we don't have someone from Emgage to respond to your criticisms, but
Let me
I
put
will
it
be
this way, Jalal. Just
Yeah.
one last thing. I have challenged Emgage board members and the CEO himself in WhatsApp groups since January and February. And I have
Okay.
always asked them very, very simple questions. I have said, what would it take for you to walk away from the Democrats? In what scenario? Give me anything. Just tell me what the calculus is. If you're going to tell me that this is like the best thing for the Muslim community, if I close my eyes and pinch my nose and try to give you 70,000 excuses, to say that you're, perhaps a good faith actor and you're just mistaken. Maybe, rubbam, it's possible. But tell me the situation in which you don't call Muslims to go back. How many bodies? How many Palestinians? How many lands have to be conquered? And I couldn't get an answer, Jalal. Nobody would answer me because there is no answer. That Engage and other groups, they are tied and wedded, married, betrothed to the Democratic Party, and there is no leverage there whatsoever. This is the idea of politics through relationships, that if we are loyalty first politics, if we prove our loyalty, then they will throw us some breadcrumbs. They will give us optics. They will give us some diversity hires. They will tokenize one of our own and put them in a high position. And this is exactly the type of politics, Jalal, who has put us into the genocide in the first place. This is exactly the type of politics that has led us to the situation why these organizations are complete failures, and why I care, and why I take time away from my family and I spend way too much time on WhatsApp, because these people do not have sound political vision. They benefit individually, they benefit through optics, they benefit through just breadcrumbs, and they have no plan to build actual power for Muslims in America. And that's why it upsets me, Jalal. That's why it upsets me. So yes, it's true that Emgage is not here to defend themselves, but they've had their chances. They've had their opportunities. And the Muslim community is waking up for groups like Emgage and other groups that are going to go with what I've been calling biryani diplomacy, the idea that you're going to do loyalty first politics, and you're going to ingratiate yourself and humiliate yourself in front of power in order to get what you want. It has led us to where we are today. And if anybody wants to wave around their credentials and say, I've been doing this for 10 years, I've been doing this for 15 years, you are the problem. Your 10 and 15 years have got us nothing. And your 10 and 15 years and all of your experience now counts as a strike against you and not actually as something for you. That the Muslim community, alhamdulillah, has woken up, and they have started taking these people to account, and they have started pushing it back against these people, and they have started building other things on their own. And I'm here for it, Jalal. We are going to build something new. We're going to build something different. We're going to convert. And this is different, where Mehdi was wrong again when it comes to saying, okay, well, we tried to swing the election in 2000 and we swung it to Bush, and look how that turned out. This is different, Jalal. We are going to build something different and new. We are going to build something that will bring power, political power, to the Muslims of America. That's going to be smart. It's going to be principled, and it's going to be dignified. It's not going to get us rich. It's not going to get us appointments. It's not going to get us Defense Department contracts. It's not going to sell out our brothers and sisters in Palestine or in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen or anywhere else. It's not going to be cynical. It's not going to be based on the politics of cynicism, which is mostly what we see from these talking heads that we see today, who are trying to push us back to voting for Harris in a month.
Thank you very much, Imam Tom. I mean, I think we have a fair share of organizations like Emgage, probably in the UK, who are deeply connected to the Labour Party. And we had very similar conversations here. And it did seem to me that the Muslim community was completely separated and disconnected from organizations that were effectively sold out to the political parties, no matter what. There were no conditions by which they would separate themselves from those political parties. And I think you may have noticed there was an iftar. It was during Ramadan with the Labour Party, and it was wholesale condemnation of those Muslim leaders who decided they're going to attend that iftar. So Jazakallah khair. I think that's a really powerful response to the actions of some organizations. Let me turn to Michigan, because it seems to me, and again, I'm an outsider here, but it seems to me that Michigan is probably the showdown state here. I mean, of course, there are 7 swing states, and there are other states where Muslims have a substantial minority, let's call it that. I mean, not a very big majority, but a substantial minority in those states. But Michigan is where it seems the greatest activity from the Democrats seems to be focused. And it seems where commentators argue that the election could be won or lost. You've been to Michigan on a number of occasions over the last few weeks. Just give me an appreciation of the political temperature on the ground, please.
Very good. Actually, I'm heading to Michigan Friday. I'll be in Michigan Friday. Be giving a khutbah in Canton.
I was meant to join you if I.
Yeah, inshallah. Alhamdulillah. So Michigan is the key state. Mathematically speaking, statistically speaking, there are 9 scenarios in which Harris has a pathway to get the electoral college votes that she needs to obtain the White House. Out of 9 of those scenarios, 6 out of the 9 involve Michigan. Okay, meaning that there's only 3 scenarios in which she can lose Michigan and still become president. And this is the highest number than for any other state, than for Pennsylvania or for Georgia or for Arizona or for any other state. So Michigan certainly is the key state. And I will say this, that I predict, and we know in politics, predictions make a fool out of you. I predict that this election is going to be very, very similar to 2016. I think that Democrats are plastering on a smile and putting on a stiff upper lip, to use your phrase, and they are hiding their panic that is soon going to engulf the party. That the numbers have been kind to them. I think flattering, I would say, just like they were in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. I think that they are in for a very, very, very rude awakening when it comes to November 5th. And here's why I say that. Among the reasons, many, many reasons. First of all, because, again, I'm in probably 100 WhatsApp groups, hundreds of messages a day. I try to keep a pulse on how people are feeling. People have come around to abandon Harris and abandon the Democrats. Let's just say more people than I thought. Since, again, I've been doing this since about a year ago, November, December, I sort of got involved in these sorts of groups and started paying attention carefully, trying to study the issues, educated myself. Who's the actors in this sort of thing? What are people doing? I watched the beginning of the uncommitted movement, and we'll talk about that in a second. And in January and February, it felt like to me that, okay, there's only a small group that really understands how evil the Democrats are here. And a great number of Muslims are going to end up being tricked by them. Now, I have been completely proven wrong. Like, I have been pleasantly surprised at how many Muslims, common everyday Muslims, that, again, a year ago would have been very, very sympathetic, even would have been willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the Democratic optics and the discursive sort of breadcrumbs that they give, and these sort of fluff statements, these empty words, the lip service. Everybody sees through it now. When this recent statement came out about, we'll give you, we'll pressure Israel. Israel has 30 days to clean up their act, or else we're going to start conditioning military aid. I didn't see anybody fall for it. I would not have predicted that back in February. So we're maturing and we're getting smarter at a very, very rapid pace, which is great. The uncommitted movement, circling back to that, which, being someone who was involved in abandoned Biden from the beginning, when the uncommitted movement came about, I observed it from the beginning, saying that this is probably a containment operation. This is probably something that is tied to the Democratic Party in order to contain the abandoned Biden movement and sort of slowly nudge people back to the Democratic Party come November. Exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. That the upper leadership, they ended up betraying the base and the sentiment of the base, and basically saying, yeah, you saw their nonsensical non-endorsement, where they said, we don't formally endorse Harris, but we can't vote for Trump, and we are telling people not to vote for third party. Cast anti-Trump votes. That was their recommendation. Anti-Trump votes that aren't third party. Who does that leave, Jalal? That leaves Harris. So it was a sort of cowardly, I would say, to be frank, endorsement of Harris. Like, if you're going to endorse Harris, at least be like Emgage and say it proudly. It was an endorsement of Harris, though they didn't want to use the E word. But what's happened since then, Jalal, is that the base of the uncommitted movement has called foul. They are trying to reorganize, and they are trying to reclaim the movement, and they are saying that the leadership that betrayed us does not represent us. That if we had known that they were going to go for Harris at the end of it, we would have never taken part in the uncommitted movement. And that is something that the uncommitted movement, if you want to have a generous number to it, 750,000 people across the country, right? This is a significant amount of people. It became a movement in different states. It has a national structure, etc. So this was something that is a big deal. So again, uncommitted, the top leadership who sold out to the Democratic Party is on an island. They're not supported by their base. So the Democratic Party might feel good and think for a second, well, we played that right with uncommitted, and we've got Emgage that's going to beat the Muslims back, and we're creating all these groups every single week. We see a new group, Muslim Women for Harris and Muslims for Harris, and this group, I don't know, from different there's different ethnicities. They're using our ethnic divisions against us. They're using everything, but these are all astroturf, Jalal. They're all paper tigers. It's all perception. The actual people are not having it. And I'm happy about that. I'm proud of that. I think that this is a milestone for Muslims in America politically. And again, just to put it bluntly, I think that the Democrats are in for a very, very rude awakening on November 5th.
Can I ask you about the Green Party? Because I watched a little video, a snippet on social media where I think it was a few months back, where you came out in support of the Green Party. Is that still your position? And there have been some valid concerns raised about the Green Party, their position on Russia, their position on Syria in particular, but also their social positioning. The Green Party is a very socially liberal party, or very progressive party in terms of its social inclinations. And some of those things, political and social, do not sit very kindly, I suppose, with Muslim sensitivities or Muslim opinion. So how do you reconcile those issues with your endorsement of the Green Party?
Fantastic. Well, just to put it on record, my exact statement that I'm going with now is I believe that all Muslims should vote third party, and the most strategic vote is the Green Party. Okay? So maybe I just am guilty of what I just said. Maybe that makes me a coward. I'm not using the E word. However, the reason that I say this, so I am telling people to vote Green Party. I think that voting Green Party is the smart choice, but not because of necessarily I agree with everything that the Green Party says or stands for. In fact, the fact that they cannot win makes it easier to endorse the Green Party, because the parts of their positions and policies and the things that we find distasteful about them will never come to pass because they will not win. So we're essentially voting for them for a different reason. And here's the important point of that people have to understand what they're doing when they're voting. Unfortunately, this is part of our political immaturity, that people think that we're choosing horses in a horse race, or people think that we're, rooting for a soccer match or a football match. This is not how your vote works. Your vote is essentially an attempt in coordinated action that is supposed to build power for you and change the behavior of the political actors that are on the scene. So we're not necessarily voting for the Green Party because we like everything that they stand for, or because we think that there are people there. And Sami Hamdi articulated this well in a WhatsApp message. He said that people think that they're voting for affiliation. We're not voting for affiliation. We're voting as a tool. What is the tool? And is it appropriate to our objective? Our objective is to punish the Democrats for their support of genocide and to attach a political cost to the support of genocide and the Zionist occupation in general. What's our tool to do that? It happens to be voting for the Green Party in this particular election. What's the long-term strategy? It's not just to simply vote for the Greens and accept the status quo as is, accept every single potential presidential candidate as is. No. The idea, and this is what distinguishes us from 2000 when we pushed Bush into office, is that we need to convert the energy and the infrastructure and the organization that we have built in the last 12 months to something that transcends where we're at now. Possibility one, and it's an unlikely possibility, but just to do a thought experiment, is if all of the Muslims who are planning on voting Green registered as Green Party members, perhaps we would have such a critical mass within the Green Party that we could then take over effectively the Green Party and control the policies, and then rid it from the policies that we don't agree with, or at least get it minimized to a level of no harm. Possibility two is that we take the same vehicles that we have constructed in the last 12 months, all of the NGOs, all of the 501c3s and 501c4s, and all of the PACs and the super PACs and all the organizations, and we convert it into something else, whether it's a new political party or whether it's other types of think tanks or institutes or infrastructure. We need infrastructure to allow. We don't have the leaders that we want. We look across the political spectrum. Every single person, let's go to the socialists, go to the Libertarian Party, go to all of them, Cornel West even. We don't see the people that we want across the board. We don't see the potential leaders that we actually want. But we have to build the infrastructure today to create the possibility for the leaders that we want to be an option tomorrow to actually have that possibility exist. So we have to realize what we're doing when we're voting for the Green Party, as is my recommendation, is that this is domino one or domino two of a line of dominoes. This is a sequential plan for Muslim Americans to build political power in the United States. And it is not simply we're now affiliated with the Green Party and we're all in with them and we love everything that they do and we're going to take them into, with open arms. That's not what we're calling for at all.
I think that's a really coherent argument and a great response. I had a message sent to me from a sister in Chicago, a message from a sister in Chicago, where she says she agrees. She's not going to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans. So that part she agrees. But she finds it very difficult then to vote for any of the third party candidates, in particular the Green Party.
I think that the most straightforward argument is that we need to quantify our displeasure with genocide. Okay. And that's why, and I know that you wanted to talk about abstention, in general, and that's why abstaining is not an option. And that's why even I'm not so happy, although I'm generally pleased with, let's say, the USCMO's guidance on the election and CARE's guidance on the election, who has said, basically, vote third party, vote your conscience, don't vote for the main two parties. That's better, but it's not giving us a strategic move that will quantify our power, right? And so the Muslims rallying behind a third party upon the assumption, and I've had other people bring it up to me, well, what if the election is too close to call? Should we be voting Trump? I say that I think that Trump's going to win anyway. I think that Harris is going to lose and lose badly. But I think that if you vote for Trump or if you don't vote or you disperse your votes across the third parties or whatever it is, you lose that quantifiability of your protest. That if we have the bulk of Muslims putting their votes, consider the Green Party just a placeholder, right? Just a vote bank, right? Some place that we're registering in a quantifiable way our discontent with the choices that we have, with the policy of unconditional support for genocide. That this is I think the most straightforward argument.
So you want a vessel to quantify the Gaza vote?
Yes, absolutely. The election has to be a mandate, or excuse me, a referendum on Gaza. If we make the election a referendum on Gaza, we win. That is the most important thing as far as discourse goes, that Harris has to lose, and it has to be because of Gaza.
Now, what about this argument that you guys are doing this because you want to build leverage within the Democratic Party over the next 4 years? So the argument goes that the Democratic Party still remains the natural home for Muslim voters. Yes, we're disenchanted over Gaza, but inevitably, by walking away, we can build some sort of leverage within the party. I mean, do you buy that argument?
I don't really. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out categorically, but I'm not going to hold my breath and wait for it to come to pass. I've paid attention to the Democratic Party enough to know. I mean, look at their behavior. They are the most anti-democratic party of all of the parties that currently exist. They have tried to subvert popular will and the will of their base in every single way and at every single turn and at every single opportunity for a long time. When it comes to Bernie Sanders and how they torpedoed Bernie Sanders' campaign, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, people remember that. When it comes to the current process of how when Biden stepped down and then sort of making it a no contest, making sure that it didn't go to an open candidacy at the convention, the Democratic Party has so much spite for their own base that they have demonstrated psychopathic levels of animosity and rancor to the very people that they depend on to vote for them. So I do not have any hopes that the Democratic Party is redeemable as such. I do think that building power outside of the two-party structure is going to be very, very key. I think that it is possible. I do think that it is possible. We have a history in the United States of America of third parties coming out of nowhere and then becoming one of the main two parties, right? So it's true. We don't have the Whig Party anymore, right? Like these parties have. There has been some change over the last 200 years. So there's a precedent there, and we need to be able to exercise it. It's time for the two-party system, and especially the Democratic Party, to be unseated and for a new political horizon to be forged, and it has to be done outside of the party. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be wrong if it works, Jalal. And that's one of the things that, even we talked to some of the HT guys in Tooting, right, in London and all these other different places. I'm happy to be wrong if it works. I'm not an ideologue. I'm not somebody who's, if the Democratic Party wakes up on November 6th, as was sort of Mehdi's, exaggeration to sort of, strawman us. If the Democrats wake up on November 6th and say, you know what, guys, we've been wrong. We've done everything wrong. We need to really do some soul searching and we need to be more democratic. We need to be more responsive to our base. Then maybe we can talk. But I don't see that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I were in a conversation on one of these WhatsApp groups where a good brother, mashallah, made a point about our stance on the election. And I think, to paraphrase, he suggested that we're giving oxygen to a corrupt system. Wouldn't it be better to quantify your votes by Muslims en masse abstaining? And if they abstained, they stick it to the system. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people did that in wider society, then the system would collapse under the weight of its delegitimacy. I mean, how do you see such an argument?
I mean, I see that argument as coming from leftist influence and somebody who was an anarchist before Islam. Like, this is a familiar argument to me, but I do not buy it. I think it actually, ironically, takes Locke at his word that there is some sort of social contract between the rulers and the ruled. That if we all stayed home, that the government would just pack up and leave and disband itself on November 6th. It's far-fetched. I think Locke was fronting. I think Locke was completely trying to speak into being a system that did not yet exist, that he was giving legitimacy to. So to put it very, very simply, participating in a system does not necessarily sustain it, and abstaining from a system does not necessarily bring it down. That is the most succinct way that we can put it. That there are different types of participation. Some participation in some systems is actually subversion, and actually the participation in particular types of participation in a system might actually ruin it. Okay, that's well known. And certain types of abstention from systems actually keep them going. In fact, have you ever heard of voter turnout numbers being broadcasted loudly in the United States? Has anybody? I mean, voter turnout has been below 50% for a good number of elections in the United States. That hasn't done anything to dent the legitimacy because the system won't admit the legitimacy, right, in the first place, right? So even if 10%, 5%, 1% came out to vote, you wouldn't hear about it in the news. You would only see 50% voted this way and 49% voted that way. They would never even talk about it. So the thing is that we need a quantifiable and legible political action. And unfortunately, staying home is not a legible political action. It will be erased and forgotten, and you will have done nothing.
Imam Tom, I would like to ask you about the US empire. Now, there is a concern from us outsiders, those on the periphery of the empire, and we sort of have come to the impression, and maybe it's an incorrect impression, that many US Muslims have sort of swallowed the US exceptionalism pill and believe that US power is generally a force for good, even if, Gaza has been a blot on its record. But generally, the world without the US would be a world which would be worse off. I mean, where do you fit into that conversation about just US imperialism and US power?
That's a very good question. I think that US foreign policy is the most harmful thing to the Ummah and to the US. Now, that's not to say that categorically that there might not in the future, if you were to change US foreign policy and reduce its hegemony, that another sinister power might replace it. That is true. However, as things stand right now, US foreign policy is the biggest problem of the Ummah, in my estimation. If you think about all the Morsis, all the Imran Khans, all of the Erdogans, all of the, all of the leaders that the Muslim community across the world has attempted to put forth, that if you take away the persistent, aggressive meddling of the United States foreign policy, I think that things begin to change and things begin to open up in very interesting ways. We'll never know, essentially, what these leaders would have been capable of without U.S. interference and U.S. meddling. And that's why I think that it's very important. And I think one of the things that people have woken up to, hopefully, and what Muslim Americans have to do a better job of going forth after the election, is to understand that one of our most important roles here in the United States is to change the policy of this country, of the United States. That there is a duty, I think, and a unique duty, even an exceptional duty, to reduce the harm that the United States does. And exactly what you said, there's a temptation. U.S. military power is like the ring of Lord of the Rings. You think that you can put it on and it won't affect you. You think that you can use it for Pakistan. You think that you can use it for Syria. You think that you can use it for whatever your, back home, quote unquote, is, and it will just be benign. That's not true. That's not true. That it's not as we say, the juice is not worth the squeeze. That even if you might get a very, very minuscule or targeted or specific benefit out of it, that the harms of having unleashed the system, increase the reach of these tentacles, increase the reach of the military bases and military activity and all these sorts of dependencies that the United States then leverages in ways that meet its interests, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. And so we really do need to, this is part of I think if we were to articulate a Muslim American political platform, which needs to be done, and it can't simply look, I've been a little bit disappointed in previous attempts at doing this, because most of it just looks like the left. It looks like the left when it comes to issues of immigration and homelessness and universal health care. These are all left issues, right? I think we need a more bipartisan or even a nonpartisan Muslim American political platform, and non-interventionism is an important part of that. I think changing the foreign policy of the U.S. to establish bounds and conditions for its military aid, to reduce its footprint, to decommission its bases, to bring U.S. troops back onto U.S. soil, and to stop them from being all over the world as basically the world's policemen. I think that is an extremely important aspect of what we should be going for.
Now, of course, U.S. imperialism, U.S. militarism is founded on some ideological principles. So we had a conversation about this previously in an interview, but these principles we could summarize as being quite liberal, principles of liberalism. How much should your project to expose Western imperialism express a denunciation or a criticism of liberalism as an ideology? I mean, in many ways, there are movements in America beyond the Muslim community that have had this conversation already. Yes, of course, the traditional left have talked a lot about and had provided criticisms of liberalism. But of course, even on the right, we're now seeing the emergence of a post-liberalism, sort of a liberalism, a U.S. pre-constitution, a U.S. pre-independence in terms of a type of United States that is not founded on these liberal principles. And how much should we engage with those ideological conversations moving forward?
Excellent. We have to recognize our distinctiveness from those movements, that we are not those movements. And even if we can appreciate elements of their diagnoses, just like I can appreciate Marx and his diagnosis of capitalism, we can disagree vehemently with their prescriptions about what should be done. And there's a register in which you can speak to people where you're attempting to meet them where they're at and speak to them in a language that is legible. That is important. So if we're going to be, yes, like I critique liberalism every day. So if I'm speaking to people that are part of the post-liberal right, et cetera, then that's going to be an important discursive part of that. However, that doesn't mean that we are in agreement on many, many things. In fact, if you go back to the sort of nostalgic times that many of the post-liberal right sort of fantasize about, that was a time of genocide. That was a time of genocide on American soil. That was a time of slave trade. That was a time of horrible racism. That these things are stains on the history of the United States of America. Some people would even say founding stains, like foundational, essential stains that cannot be overcome. That's a debate whether it can be overcome or not. I think that this is the role of dawah. I think that this is what gets us into the conversation of what are we doing in the United States as Muslims. Now, there's certain people who have sort of quote unquote come or arrived from elsewhere, though technically everybody arrives from elsewhere in the United States other than the natives. But there's people such as myself who, my family's been in the United States for 100 plus years, that there's nowhere else to go to. So what are we doing? This is ribat. This is dawah. This is the area where we should be providing the message of Islam. That this is where we actually put Islam up in the conversation with these other ideological movements that are trying to make sense of things and trying to forge a way forward. That we can show people that Islam actually has a lot to offer American society. Islam actually has a lot of correctives that could sort of remedy the excesses of liberalism and its false universalisms and other things, so that we don't keep swinging back and forth, wildly oscillating between historical extremes. That we need to take seriously the ideological project of Islam in America and proclaiming it and making it accessible to people and clarifying what it is for people. And then we can be a partner on equal terms. If we make sort of this, if we take as legitimate, and some people have critiqued it, but if we take the idea that there's this sort of public square where people can exchange ideas and hopefully the best ideas win, then we need to be there. And we need to be there as fully Muslims, as fully dedicated to Islam, as people who believe that Islam is the best way for all of humanity. And that doesn't mean that we're going to force people. Obviously, it's against our religion to force people to believe in it. But we have a duty to clarify, and we have a duty to put forth, and we have a duty to offer solutions from our tradition that could help the local situation where each and every one of us live.
Imam Tom Facchine, it's been a pleasure as always. Jazakallah khair very much for your time, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from you and from all the Muslims who are fighting for Palestine and for Gaza. Jazakallah khair, brother.
Ameen. Thank you so much.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.